Now, Professor Ed Blakely is an honorary professor in urban policy at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. He served for 2 years as the Executive Director of the Office of Recovery and Development Administration for New Orleans following the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. And he joins me now to discuss the findings of the Flood Inquiry's interim report. Professor Ed Blakely, what are your thoughts about the series of recommendations made by this inquiry? It's only been 7 months since this disaster.
Well, these recommendations actually coming out very quickly. It takes a lot of time to investigate a matter like this. But think of this. These were recommendations for a flood we had, not for one we might have. So the recommendations about the last battle, not the next battle. So with sea change, rise and change temperatures, we're going to have new things to face, and these recommendations will help us, but we still have more to do.
If we look at some of these recommendations that were made, some of the things that really struck me were, for example, needing a central dispatch for rescue helicopters and having some sort of alarms on creek systems. Are you surprised that those sorts of things are not in place here?
Well, I'm a little bit surprised, but not too surprised because we haven't had something like this happen before. Again, many places already have these things, so the technology exists. But we really have to think that the river may be higher, the dangers may be greater, and the alarm system may be too late.
So does it really take a disaster like this perhaps to give a very tragic wake-up call to authorities before they're able to plan for these so-called worst-case scenarios?
It does. It's unfortunate, but it does. But I'd like to point your attention that most of these recommendations are several years out. And I've been through this before. We did this in Oakland, California, 136 recommendations. 10 years later, only 2 were still in operation because people had forgotten.
So how do we make sure that authorities don't forget and that these recommendations are put in place? The Queensland Premier is promising to do that, but does it take public pressure to make sure that these are followed up?
Yes, I think 2 things. One of them is there should be a disaster management commission. There's a perfectly good body that's been established. It's staying working to prevent the next disaster and be ready for a disaster and monitor what's done. And there ought to be public reports on an annual basis as to what's being done in the recommendations so the public is fully aware of what we've done and where we have to go.
Can you explain, for example, another one of the recommendations was not only to train some more swiftwater rescue members of those teams, but also to make sure they had things like waterproof radios. Now, that seems pretty obvious. Can you explain why emergency services, not only in Queensland, but throughout Australia, indeed in many parts of the world, often find themselves without basic bits of equipment that the public would expect them to have?
Well, the basic reason for that is it's the last thing on the agenda. Schools, jails, and many other things come first. And the last thing you're thinking about is the disaster, so disaster equipment comes last on the agenda. We have to make it first on the agenda now.
And what about for small councils who find themselves with not a lot of resources? The onus is really put on them. How do councils that don't have a lot of financial resources, under a lot of budgetary strains, how do they meet some of these, high costs of implementing some of these recommendations like this?
The only way they can do that is come to the state. They're not able to do it with local revenues. Many of these things are way beyond their capacity. So I think the state will have to create a fund to provide money for them to do these things.
I'm interested in your experience there in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. What was the big barrier? I mean, there's public outcries over tragedies like that. People say it's terrible, we can't let this happen again. But, as you seem to be suggesting, there's often a little bit of resistance or to getting things done. What was the biggest barrier that you faced there?
Well, the biggest barrier was to replace things just the way they were. For example, putting levees right back where they were only left people to the same degree of vulnerability for a storm that wasn't even as big as Katrina. So you really have to rethink what you're doing. And the best recommendation would have been to let the river run through the city and many things like that. But the haste of putting things in place meant we went back rather than forward.
So are you saying that that's a message for a city like Brisbane, for example, the worst flood that we'd had in many, many decades, that we shouldn't be concentrating on putting things back to how they were, but preparing for something that, God forbid, could be even worse?
Yes, I am. And I think we have to do it now.
Professor Ed Blakely, thank you very much for coming in this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.